episode 75 of Grace and Steel. I'm Kevin Steele. Earlier this month, a wall called How Do You Challenge White Supremacy was erected at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. This structure was intended as a visual space whereby students could express their thoughts on the evils of the supposed domination of our culture by white people. It was quickly pulled down after being trolled by alt-righters. The wall was the brainchild of a group called Third Space, which was formerly known as the University of Victoria's Women's Centre. Why Third Space? Because women are now not inclusive enough for UVic's student-sponsored feminists, who now represent, quote, self-identified women, non-binary, and fluid gender people, unquote. In other words, the Women's Centre now represents women who are not, in fact, women. And when the changeover was made in 2016, traditional radical feminists were purged by force. Tara Prema is one of those purged women. A former University of Victoria student, she now represents a group called the UVic Women's Centre, that's women with a Y. She spoke last week about the tumultuous events at the University of Victoria to Kevin Michael Grace.
What do you understand feminism to mean?
Well, speaking for myself and some of us, we are old school feminists, I guess you would call us. We have some very specific ideas about changing society right now. What we're concerned about is the material conditions for women worldwide. And by material conditions, we mean poverty, childbearing, reproduction, these issues that overwhelmingly affect women, violence, rape, trafficking, prostitution, pornography. These are issues that have a great deal of harm to women around the world, including women here in Canada, where folks may be aware of the extent of child prostitution and sex trafficking of vulnerable people. So for me and for many of us, feminism is about protecting the most vulnerable women in society. It is not necessarily, although this is also really important, about simply achieving equity, pay equity, an equal number of CEOs and politicians. That is also can be described as a feminist view. It is not a radical feminist view. I am a radical feminist.
Now, there is a school of thought which argues that the feminist movement is not needed anymore because everyone is a feminist. There are few people, hardly any, who would describe themselves as being anti-feminist or argue that women are in any way inferior to men. What would your response
Really?
to that?
I think you can go to hundreds of websites online and find people who say exactly that women should be subjugated, women should be punished, women are vile and evil. There are hundreds of websites. Or you could, if like I have done, to make statements about stopping violence against women, making statements that are openly feminist, and I will get dozens and hundreds of messages from men who think I should be punished for saying things like this. They do exist. It is a very large movement. It is certainly a large movement in the United States. It is on the upswing here in Canada, here in Victoria. We saw the screening of an anti-feminist film the day after Women's Day on March 9th at the Fairfield Community Centre. It's a film called The Red Pill. These are men's rights activists, which would be fantastic if they were actually working for men, but they're mostly working off their frustration about women's equality and their really virulent disagreement with that. I've been stalked by these men. It's not an easy time at all to be a feminist, to be an actual feminist in Canada right now. I will agree that everybody calls themselves a feminist. Trudeau calls himself a feminist. That doesn't make it so. It makes it a selling point. And we are not commodities.
Well, we'll get to the issue of commodities a little later because I particularly want to speak to you about the issue of prostitution and the women's movement. But I suspect that a lot of this anti-feminist animus is driven by the belief held by many men that feminists are engaged, not all of them, but many feminists are engaged in the active denigration of men and of their role in the world.
No, of course not. But I think what really threatens them is women being independent. When women can no longer be bullied and controlled and, made into chattel, as we used to be in marriage. When women can vote and have independent political affiliations and have solidarity with each other, that's very threatening. And that is happening as well. So we have this very polarized society right now, where women, on the one hand, are gaining some class consciousness, let's say, some understanding of their situation and who is responsible for it. And it's not individual men, At the same time, men, I think, are feeling threatened by a situation where they're being treated differently. I think we all have the same enemies, which is a system that dehumanizes everybody.
Now, it is widely believed these days, it's not a majority view, not yet, but it seems to be heading in that direction, that gender, or what we used to call sexuality, is a, quote, is societal construct, unquote. It strikes me that this belief strikes at the very heart of the idea of women. What do you think?
Right. Gender is what we used to call sex roles. And so that's the act of being masculine or being feminine, performing femininity, being a man or being a woman. And so gender recently has come to mean something very different from just the sex roles, the social constructs. Now people seem to think it means an identity, an internal sense of self, which can change or can be fluid. And I think it's a matter of science and biology and common sense that people cannot change their sex. But this is what we're being asked to believe now, is that people, by adopting different labels, can change their sex and men can become women, and anyone can identify as a woman or as a man. What we're seeing, however, is a lot of men identifying as women and taking over women's space. This has happened here at the University of Victoria, where the UVic Women's Center no longer exists, and it's now being run as a collective for transgender people and gender fluid people and gender queer people and asexual people and transsexual people.
Well, we'll get to that in just a minute. But this ties in with the belief in another idea called intersectionality. Now, it seems fairly obvious to me that the idea of a woman's movement celebrates and acts on behalf of a group of people who share one commonality, which is that they are in fact women.
Right.
If intersectionality, I think, is a war of all against all, where instead of women advocating for themselves, you have endless disputes about black women or transgender women or disabled women or what have you. I think that this intersectionality has to be the death of feminism eventually, if it is not curtailed. Do you agree?
What we're speaking of there is identity politics, and where identity becomes one's internal identity and circumstances become the defining characteristic of one's politics. And what we see is that, as you described, women, it's sort of a race to see who is the most oppressed. So disabled women can call out able-bodied women for oppressing them, and so on. So we have this call-out culture where it seems like, yes, people are always seeking to define who has power over them instead of working together to against their common enemy. So as radical feminists, which is distinct from other forms of feminism It incorporates some other forms of feminism, but as radical feminists, we are working in solidarity with all women, all female people around the world, and to improve their material conditions, not to engage in these endless battles over who has the most pure politics. That's not what we're about. We're not all pure. I'm speaking to you right now, which is something that many liberal feminists would not do. You know, the liberal feminists seem to believe more in words than in actions. And they seem to believe more in individual delusions about the self than in changing the material conditions of women who are disproportionately poor around the world.
Now, I'm looking at the page for the third space, which is the name of the organization which replaced the Women's Center at the University of Victoria. And it says Third Space was born in 1982 as the Emily. Eventually, the Emily Collective acquired Ain't I a Woman, a publication originally produced by the Women's Studies Department that dealt with issues of gender, race, and decolonization. In 1999, the collective combined the two papers under a new masthead, the Women's Publication Network, which also became the name of the new collective. We came to understand that being a regular paper, the Emily to deal with feminism, and another paper, Ain't I a Woman to deal with gender and race, ran counter to our mandate of inclusion for all. It had also been pointed out that the Emilys after whom we had named ourselves were all white Europeans, and we agreed that this too was not inclusive. This strikes me as a very strange statement, as if Emily is a white name, and therefore it is to be deprecated somehow.
I can't even explain that statement. I have really very little insight into these thought processes that are going on.
Well, later on the page, it says, we hope that this paper will be a place for residents of third space, for those who live wholly or partially on the margins. This seems to be a deliberate kind of marginalization here, because women do not live on the margins. Women are more than half of humanity. But there seems to be a kind of a desperate need here to seek out, I don't know, perhaps further oppression.
Self-victimization. Like I was saying, the race to be the most oppressed, the race to innocence. Female students are 60% of the University of Victoria. There is no women-only space at the University of Victoria this year for the first time since 1985. So this inclusion that they speak of it is a dissolving of boundaries. It is a celebration of the individual at the expense of the collective. And in this case, it's a celebration of a very small number of individuals who are confused about their gender.
Well, speak to this question of women's space and why it's important.
Well, women's space has always been important, from nunneries to separatist communes. Women in the 1800s, there were no women's bathrooms. For example, women did not have private spaces in the social realm, and as such, rarely went out, rarely engaged in the social realm. Because what would they do? It was, women actually had to lobby for public washrooms. And as you know, you may know, they still are lobbying for more public washrooms. Because we all complain that the lines for the women's room are too long. You know, women's space, in a political sense, gives us a chance to speak together as sisters without the presence of men, which can be inhibiting to women, especially women who are partnered with men. It allows us to talk about things that men don't frankly want to hear about, including, our bodily functions, for example. And these are very important for our reproductive health. Sometimes even our doctors are ignorant, and we learn more from each other. And for example, with dealing with cramps and menopause, than we would certainly learn from other sources. And we can validate each other's experience. This is a part of being independent women and women across the political spectrum, from conservative women, faith communities, and women on the left, all have for hundreds and thousands of years gathered separately from men, whether it's for a spiritual reason or a political reason or just for fun.
Now, Tara, you were a student, you're a graduate of UVic, are you?
I am a former student.
And you were associated with the Women's Center there?
I was.
Take me through the process by which the Women's Center became the third space.
It happened very suddenly, and it happened at the UVic Student Society Board level and at the Women's Center Collective level. And so what happened is that one of the coordinators is a transgender person. This person is no longer a coordinator. This coordinator, Daphne Shayed, was treasurer. Daphne identifies as a whole list of things.
A Hindu tranny cyborg, I believe.
That's the short version, yes.
Okay, well, I mean, so I'm going to interrupt here to say that this sounds very much like deliberate trolling because, first off, a cyborg is not a person.
Yes, it's a very strange situation, and Daphne was known for being very antagonistic towards Pride, for example. Daphne promoted the vandalizing of a Pride installation, a rainbow crosswalk, because it was not inclusive enough, according to Daphne. Daphne declared war on the bathroom signs in the Student Union building and vandalized them, and was rather celebrated. You know, it's very outrageous, and people seem to respond to it, you know, in different ways. But in the end, Daphne had an entirely different vision and persuaded others to go along with this idea that a women's center is not inclusive enough, and it needs to include people like Daphne who don't identify as women, but nevertheless want the use of this space. One of the things that triggered a lot of people, I think, was that Daphne has had an orchidectomy, has no testicles, but has a penis, and displayed a full-page, full frontal nude photograph in the Third Space zine, which was published with the UVic Women's Center funds. There are hundreds of copies printed. It's still available online.
Yes, I'm looking at a picture of it here. Now,
so this looks to us like.
Sorry, I was just going to say that the traditional narrative of transsexualism is that there are a series of operations required, and that one of the operations is the removal of the penis because women don't have penises. I wonder what you make of, we see more and more of this, well, I am a woman and I have a penis, or this is a female penis. I don't know, that this strikes me as a kind of linguistic terrorism.
Are you familiar with Jordan Peterson? Professor at University of Toronto?
Oh, yes.
Yes, they can identify however they want. They can identify as space aliens. They don't have the right to force us to use the language that they use. They don't have the right to force us to accept them.
Daphne says in this essay, in that issue, which contains the nude photograph, when I tell you that I am a tranny, I do so with the prerogative of self-authority. Now, self-authority, there has to be some limits to this. There is a popular meme, which you may have heard of, I identify as an attack helicopter. Now, this was meant to be satirical, but when you have a person, and a person who occupied a position of some power in a feminist organization, calling himself or herself a cyborg, then obviously the prerogative of self-authority has been pushed to its limits.
Trolling is a good way to describe it. Another way to describe it would be the politics of transgression. That Whenever we put up a boundary, they will try to tear it down and try and invade our space and try and invade our bodies. Daphne has made jokes about raping a biological female person and having her cry out in pain. It's considered to be edgy. It's considered to be politically radical. It's not. It's simply bullying. And this is where women at UVic, some of us, stood up and actually said, no, we don't consent to changing this space over. We think it should continue to serve the majority of UVic students who are female and who identify as female, whatever that means.
Well, when this transformation of the Women's Center was occurring, what did you hear from, if anything, from well-known feminists across Canada?
We spoke to Sheila Day, for example, who is now, I believe, an Order of Canada recipient, one of the foremost human rights lawyers in Canada. We spoke to Lee Lakeman. It's not an issue that's on people's radar. And feminist issues are, as you say, people feel that, oh, well, that issue was settled years ago. The Women's Center was created 35 years ago. And we would argue that the same problems still exist now. But no, there's been no outcry about this. I have not been able to get the mainstream media to speak to us, mainly because they want to put our faces and names on the air. And it's been very stressful. Women have been harassed, and this includes celebrities. Celebrities have been harassed and threatened and had their shows canceled and taken away. And I'm speaking of people like Germaine Greer, who is a famous feminist from the 1980s, wrote The Female Eunuch. People like Robin Morgan, Roseanne Barr, and other women who you may not know, but we have all faced the same issues, which is being labeled bigots by the left.
Well,
being forced out of our spaces.
Here we have a situation in Victoria where a loud, aggressive man with a penis shows up, colonizes, if you will, a feminist organization and starts throwing his weight around. I would have thought that feminists would consider this to be outrageous.
When we spoke up, we were called bullies. They called us bullies. And they even made wanted posters with faces and names. It wasn't our faces and names. People who they thought were behind this, because we made fun of Daphne on Facebook and on Twitter. That's all we did. We created a Twitter account, and we made some comments on their public survey saying, no, don't change this. Don't change this on behalf of this woman with a penis, quote unquote. We deserve to have our own space. And on that basis, a number of women were banned from the UVic Women's Center and Third Space. They were prohibited from coming to the meetings. They were not allowed to be members. So the vote, when it happened, was perfectly democratic. There was no one there to object.
Now, your pinned tweet at your account, UVic Women, says, how to be trans-inclusive at UVic, take over women's space, ban feminists, call police, shut down and persecute women. When were police called?
Police were called early on when we left pamphlets by the Women's Liberation Front in the Third Space Lounge. And these are printed pamphlets that say, have the contact information for this worldwide organization, and it lists some of their principles inside, including that prostitution is harmful to women, pornography is harmful, and that we are women-born women. We are female, and that people can't change their sex. So, is a very standard pamphlet, and it had a student's email address on the back. So they called campus security and I believe notified the RCMP, calling this hate speech. according to Daphne, and according to press releases that were sent out at the time. Daphne contacted the Alexa and said, you are not welcome in the space unless you agree with our principles at Third Space, which are no longer what we would call feminist. In their principles, they celebrate sex work. They say that's empowering for women. And they say that gender and sex are really whatever you want them to be, that they don't have any biological reality, and that people who believe otherwise are bigots and should be banned. So that's their principles. And we looked into legal avenues to challenge this. We certainly wrote letters to the president of the university, to the UVSS. At this time, they were publishing wanted posters and press releases accusing us of, quote, attacking transgender people, which we did not. There was a very recent court case at the Supreme Court of British Columbia where another student group, a campus youth group, that was anti-abortion, had been putting up installations, graphic displays around campus. They were an organized student club. This university took away their funding and banned them from, would not allow them to have permits for any further events. They sued the university and they lost. And the BC Supreme Court ruled that UVic is not public space per se. It is private. They have the right to regulate what kind of groups they will allow to form and what kind of speech is permitted. And so my advice was that we would not be successful in any court action. We have the option of going to the Human Rights Tribunal, but we might not be successful there. Because, you see, gender identity has been added to the laws in BC, to the Human Rights Code, to UVic's policies, and to the Human Rights Tribunal of British Columbia. And as far as we can tell, gender identity erases sex. That if anyone can identify as a woman, then woman means nothing. So this is why we're calling for allies.
Now, an article which is on your site, which was reprinted from the Martlet, it says, after leaving feminist pamphlets at the center in January, she received an email from Daphne Shaid explaining that members of the center may not challenge certain ideology, including the notion that sex work is work and the idea that woman is defined based on a system of self-identification. Now, the early feminists, Betty Friedan onwards, the second wave of feminism, I guess you'd call it, that they were very strong on this idea of anti-prostitution and anti-pornography. Can you explain, I think I understand what sex positive means, but it seems fairly obvious to me that prostitution is degrading and dangerous, and you just have to open any, go on the internet to read a news story to find out what this is. And, we know in places in Amsterdam where sex work has been legalized, it has led to an enormous increase in human trafficking and slavery. Can you explain to me how a feminist could be pro-prostitution?
In my book, a feminist can't be pro-prostitution. And this is why we differentiate ourselves and say we are radical feminists. But this is the essence of liberalism. And one of your earlier guests was talking about this concept of liberalism as being all about choice. That choice is individual choice is the only thing that matters. So, according to this extreme liberal ideology, if someone chooses to be degraded, if someone chooses to live in poverty, if someone chooses to be exploited, that's their choice, and we should celebrate it. And if people choose to degrade themselves and sell their bodies and be used and live high-risk lifestyles and become addicted to drugs, it's their choice. And this completely overlooks and eliminates the arguments, the absolute necessity that drives these behaviors. We don't have a choice. If it's a choice between starving and prostitution, of course we will choose prostitution. The other thing is, it overlooks who is doing the exploiting here. And what they don't recognize is that if we say prostitution is good, then we're saying pimps are good, and Johns are good, and rape is good, because prostitutes are there not because they want to have sex, they're there because they need money. It's coercion. And this puts us absolutely opposed to liberal feminism. And yes, when we look at places like Germany, where they have legalized prostitution and it is fully decriminalized, they have entire warehouses, blocks long, filled with desperate refugee immigrant women working for minimum wage or less after their room and board is taken out. They have all-you-can-eat specials. They have specials for pregnant women that gangbang. The levels of sex trafficking and abuse are absolutely horrific. There are an estimated 500,000 women in prostitution in Germany now. And they are from the Philippines and Malaysia. They're from Korea, and they're from overwhelmingly from Eastern Europe and former Soviet republics. They are desperate. They are living in little concrete cubicles. And what's going to happen to them when they're used up? Because this lifestyle kills women. It uses them up. It destroys them. It is profoundly traumatic. 95% of the women in prostitution would leave immediately if they had the opportunity. And we can contrast this, fortunately, with the situation in Norway and Sweden. This is the Nordic model, where it is not illegal for a woman to prostitute herself. It is illegal for a man to buy her or to sell her. And they have provided supports, education, social welfare, safety nets, housing, health care for women who are exiting prostitution. And the rates of abuse have gone down tremendously. The rates of men and venereal disease and violence have gone down tremendously. And we could adopt that. This is an opportunity for Canada to adopt this model. We have something very close to it now. It is not legal in Canada for women to sell sex or for men to buy it. But Trudeau, being a liberal feminist, wants to change that, and he wants to decriminalize prostitution and implement the system that they have in Germany and in Amsterdam, where it's just wholesale women on the market all the time. And of course, most of these are very young women. The prime age for a woman is as soon as she is legal, and preferably younger. The average age of a girl starting street prostitution in Vancouver is 14. So again, who is doing the exploiting here? These little girls are not deciding to go out and be exploited by strange men. It's men who do it. It's men who coerce them and groom them. And it is a form of child abuse. It is horrific, and it is widespread. And do you know what's happening in Canada right now with the police? The police are sworn to uphold the law, and they have said publicly in the newspapers that they won't arrest men for buying women. They won't uphold the law because it is not legal to buy women, to buy sex.
Well, we see a lot of that in Canada. I mean, you live in Victoria, as I do, and marijuana, it's still illegal in this country, but you can hardly walk for 5 minutes in downtown Victoria without walking into a cloud of marijuana smoke. So, I mean, increasingly, the police decide which laws that they will uphold and which they won't.
Right. There's a healthy discussion about marijuana happening now. But we don't hear a healthy discussion happening about prostitution or about this wave of transgenderism. So it's big business that's driving both. I mean, to sell a woman is big business. That's big money. And there's big money in the transgender agenda.
Well, we'll get to that. We'll get to
As well.
that. We'll
If
get
you
to
can-
that in just a minute. You're obviously familiar with this phrase TERF, trans exclusionary radical feminist. Would you describe yourself as such?
Yeah. Well, it's a very derogatory term. It usually goes with die in a fire. Yeah, I've used that term. I am a radical feminist. I don't exclude trans people from my analysis, but we don't consider them women.
No, but I have seen, I've read, I've been to some websites and Twitter pages, and I know that this phrase was invented as an insult, but I know that there's a fair number of feminists who have adopted it, attempted to claim it for their own. I'm a little confused as to a relative handful of people could hijack a movement which is. The feminist movement has been powerful in North America, let's say, for 50 years. And the idea that, as I say, a handful of people could show up and say, in effect, well, this is ours now. And they get away with this. And the idea that women, half the population, it's like, oh no, your concerns are boring. We're not really interested in that anymore. We have something exciting, newer here. Do you think that's what it is?
Yeah, and like you said, there's a widespread feeling that women are equal, even though we don't have pay equity, and we don't have equal child care, we don't have equal access to birth control, for example. But we've seen this positioning that transgender people are the most vulnerable, the most oppressed, and the trajectory has been, people initially sort of feel accommodating. We like to think of ourselves as being accommodating, reasonable people. We wouldn't exclude people because of some accident of birth, being born in the wrong body. So we've seen this trajectory where first, women by nature, or by design, perhaps, are more accommodating and tend to be seeking that kind of inclusion. And so, but there's been this overreach. And what's been most surprising is that with all the resources that are now available to transgender people, why do they want to take over women's spaces? Why do they want to be in our spaces? Why can't they have their own spaces and not have to go to war with feminists? Because that's
I'll put it to you that this is male aggression.
It's divide and conquer.
No doubt you're aware.
Absolutely.
No doubt you're aware of what's going on in many prisons where men are demanding, often murderers of women, are demanding sex change operations. And then, they get to go to the women's prisons and prey on the women.
Yes, absolutely. You called it. It is male aggression. And many of these men have a fetish where they want to be feminized. They want to be treated like a woman, or like their fantasy of a woman. They want the clothes. They want to dress up. They want to cross-dress.
You're referring to this term, autogynophilia?
Yes, it's very common.
Well, I noticed it. I knew there was a old girlfriend of mine, longtime girlfriend. She had this friend, a man, who announced, this was back in the 80s, that he was a woman trapped in a man's body, and that he was going through the counseling and the hormone treatments, and there was a series of operations. And I knew this fellow fairly well. He worked in the same building as I did. And he shocked me when he said that he was going to become a lesbian after this was all completed. And as I say, I was shocked. I did a little reading, and I discovered that this was becoming more and more the norm. And actually, a friend of mine was his daughter bought him a week's columns in this paper in Seattle, this alternative paper called The Stranger. And I was really taken aback because they make their money selling classified ads. And so there would be little teasers for the classified ads, and there would be women seeking women. And a bunch of these women identified themselves as women that would have sex with trans women. And I thought, when did this become a thing? And I did a little more research and found out that it had become a very big thing indeed. It's like, how dare you refuse to have sex with me? What kind of horrible bigot are you?
Yes. Same in Victoria. You can go online on any dating website and find, in the Women for Women section, find these images of male pattern baldness and stubble. And that's the reality that we're in now. We've gone way down the rabbit hole.
Now, it would seem to me that I wanted to mention this. Jennifer Pritzker, who is described as the world's first billionaire transgender woman, made a $1 million donation to the University of Victoria so that they could establish a chair of transsexual studies. Now, you mentioned money before.
Right.
Perhaps you could comment on this.
Right. That was actually a matched grant. It was $2 million. And yeah, it seems to us with that money, they could establish any number of programs, any number of office buildings, lounges for transgender, agender, asexual, genderqueer, gender fluid people. And instead, they chose to take over the Women's Center at UVic. So this is, and it's not coincidence that this is a pharmaceutical fortune. There is big money to be made from transgender surgery and hormones. That is a lifetime customer for a pharma company. You have to take these hormones every day for the rest of your life. Plus the surgeries, this is big business, cosmetics, wigs, clothing, this whole lifestyle that's being promoted. The numbers are really, truly shocking. The numbers has gone from, I think, in the UK, 78 young people, teenagers, presenting themselves at gender clinics, to over 4,000 last year.
Well,
there are thousands of young people.
Yes, it's become very fashionable, and the media has pushed this relentlessly. I think it's horrifying, and I actually think it'll be a situation similar to that of certain psychiatric practices. You know, homosexuality used to be treated with shock therapy, and frontal lobotomies were performed on people who were difficult. The medical profession doesn't like to talk much about that sort of thing, but I suspect that in the decades to come, well, I also think that we're going to see billions or perhaps trillions in lawsuits from adults who find out that they were changed at a time when they didn't really have the option of saying no.
Right.
But I wanted to ask you one final question, which was, it seems to me that this transsexual invasion of feminism has the potential to snuff it out. What do you think about that idea?
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
Well, no, the idea, if feminism becomes identified with transsexualism, then it will cease to be a force. That if feminism is no longer advocating for women, then it will lose the power that it has had in recent decades. Do you think that
feminism will never stop advocating for women, women-born women, females? My feminism will never stop advocating for women. Radical feminism will always be what it is. You called it second wave feminism. We call it feminism, period. People who are advocating for other genders and for men's rights, they can call it what they want. But there are thousands of us, there are millions of us. I think a lot of your listeners agree with you. I think a lot of them agree with me. I think that we can actually get together and agree on certain things. And one of them is that women are women and men are men. And the sex that you are is the sex that you remain. And females have always had a connection to our own bodies, of course. because this is where we all come from. We all come from a female body. No amount of torturing the language is going to change that. No amount of changing one's pronouns is going to make one any less female. And I know that right now we're in the grip of this kind of madness, and I think that in the future we will look back at this and say, wasn't that crazy when everybody thought they could change their sex and force people to call them by other pronouns? And when they demanded that women say that men are women? I think we'll look back at this as a period of madness.
So, Tara, what can people do to support your efforts to reclaim the Women's Center at the University of Victoria for women?
I would say visit us on Twitter. We're at UVic Women, UVic-WOMYN, UVic Women with a Y. We are online, and we really encourage people to get in touch with us. As members of the Women's Liberation Front, we are really looking to make alliances with other communities, including conservative communities and faith communities who share some of the same values and who are not buying into this toxic liberal ideology and who believe that women actually mean something. So you can tweet at us at UVic Women. You can visit us at email uvicwomen@gmail.com.
Well, Tara, thank you so much for speaking to me. I've greatly enjoyed our talk.
Thank you, Kevin.